Imagine a library so vast that when it was finally set on fire, it is said to have burned for 3 whole months. Imagine a place of learning so great that students traveled to it from China, from Korea, from Tibet, from across the whole of Asia, crossing deserts and mountains and oceans, risking their lives on journeys of thousands of miles, simply for the chance to study there. Imagine a university with 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers, with soaring towers and observatories and lecture halls, where the deepest questions of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and the nature of reality itself were debated, more than 1,000 years before Oxford or Cambridge ever opened their doors. This place was real. It stood in the north of India for 7 centuries. It was called Nalanda, and it was, quite simply, one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world ever produced. And then, in a single dark chapter, it was destroyed so completely that for hundreds of years the world forgot it had ever existed. So what was this astonishing place? What miracles of knowledge were gathered within its walls? And how and why did it all come to such a violent and total end? To find out, we must return to the golden age of ancient India, to an empire we have visited before, and to a king who decided to build something that would outlast his throne. Our story begins in the 5th century of our era, under the Gupta Empire, the dynasty that presided over what many call the Golden Age of India, the age that gave the world the concept of zero and declared that the earth spins upon its axis. It was a time of extraordinary confidence, wealth, and intellectual ambition, and it was one of the Gupta emperors who founded, near the ancient heartland of Magadha, a great monastery and center of learning that would grow, over the generations that followed, into something the world had never seen before. It was not merely a monastery, though it was that. It was not merely a school. It became a true residential university, a self-contained city of learning, where students and teachers lived together, year after year dedicated entirely to the pursuit of knowledge. Kings and emperors across the centuries poured their wealth into it, endowing it with the revenues of hundreds of villages, so that its scholars never had to worry about food or shelter and could give their entire lives to study. And what a city of learning it became. At its height, Nalanda sprawled across a great campus of red brick, with monasteries and temples, lecture halls and meditation cells, gardens and lotus ponds, and towers that rose so high a visitor claimed they seemed to lose themselves in the mists of the morning. Thousands of students lived within its walls, and thousands of teachers guided them. They came from every corner of the Buddhist world and beyond, and getting in was no simple matter. Nalanda was famous and fiercely selective. At its gates stood learned guardians, scholars whose task was to question every applicant who sought entry. These gatekeepers would test a newcomer with difficult questions of philosophy and logic, and it is said that many who came confident in their learning were turned away at the threshold, unable to pass. Only those who could hold their own in debate were admitted to walk through the gate and join the community within. To be a student at Nalanda was to be among the chosen minds of a continent. Once inside, the range of what could be learned was breathtaking. Of course, at its heart, Nalanda was a Buddhist institution, and the study of Buddhist philosophy, in all its subtle and competing schools, was its great specialty. Students spent years mastering logic and metaphysics, debating the nature of the mind, of perception, of reality itself, in discussions of astonishing sophistication. But Nalanda was far more than a religious seminary. Its scholars also studied grammar and language, medicine and healing, mathematics and astronomy. There were observatories to watch the heavens. There was training in the practical arts and sciences. Students of different faiths and philosophies studied side by side, and the sharpening of the mind through rigorous debate was prized above all. It was a place where knowledge of every kind was gathered, questioned, refined, and passed on, a beating heart of human thought at the center of the ancient world. And Nalanda produced minds that changed the course of thought across Asia. Some of the greatest philosophers and logicians of the ancient world were associated with its halls, thinkers who refined the science of reasoning and debate to a razor's edge, whose works were studied and argued over from India to Tibet to China for 1,000 years. In its cells and courtyards, the deepest questions of logic, of how we know what we know, of the nature of the mind, were pushed further than almost anywhere else on earth. Great masters of medicine and mathematics, and the sacred texts taught here, and their students carried their teachings across the mountains to become the foundations of learning in whole other civilizations. To study at Nalanda was to sit, quite literally, at the feet of the finest teachers of the age. Life within its walls ran with the quiet discipline of a great monastery. The day was ordered by the ringing of bells and, remarkably, by water clocks that marked the passing hours, so that thousands of students and monks could move together through a precise schedule of study, debate, meditation, and rest. Cleanliness and routine were strictly observed. Hundreds of lectures were delivered every single day, and in the open courtyards, students gathered to test their understanding in fierce public debate. For at Nalanda, to truly know something was to be able to defend it against any challenge. It was a world of intense intellectual effort, sustained not for a few years, but across entire lifetimes, and across the lifetimes of the institution itself, for century upon century. But the true wonder of Nalanda, the thing that draws the deepest sighs from historians, was its library. It was known by a name that means, roughly, the ocean of jewels, or the mountain of truth, and it was legendary throughout Asia. The library was not a single building but a great complex, and one of its structures was said to rise 9 stories into the sky, a towering repository of knowledge unlike anything else in the world. Within these buildings were kept, by every account, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years, written painstakingly by hand on palm leaves and bound between wooden boards. Here were the sacred texts of Buddhism, but also treatises on medicine, on astronomy, on mathematics, on grammar, on philosophy, on subjects we can now only guess at. Scholars did not merely read these manuscripts. They copied them by hand year after year, so that the knowledge could be carried away and preserved elsewhere. Nalanda was not just a place that held knowledge. It was an engine that produced it and sent it out across the world. And we know all of this in vivid detail because of the remarkable travelers who came to Nalanda and wrote about it. The most famous of them was a Chinese Buddhist monk named Xuanzang, who in the 7th century undertook one of the greatest journeys in all of history. Driven by a hunger to study the true sources of his faith, he left China and traveled overland for years, across the deserts and the towering mountains of Central Asia, enduring bandits, blizzards, and near death at every turn, all to reach the sacred land of India, and above all, to reach Nalanda. And when he arrived, he stayed for years, studying under its greatest masters, mastering its philosophy, and living the life of a Nalanda scholar. He described it all: the daily routine, The debates, the hundreds of lectures held every day, the strict discipline, the deep respect for learning. When he finally returned to China, he carried with him a staggering treasure, hundreds upon hundreds of manuscripts, loaded onto animals for the long journey home, along with sacred relics and images. Those texts, translated into Chinese, would shape the course of Buddhism across all of East Asia for centuries to come. A single scholar's journey to Nalanda helped carry the wisdom of India to half the world. And Xuanzang was not alone. Other travelers followed the same path, including another Chinese monk, who left his own careful description of Nalanda's rules and daily life a few decades later, confirming the wonders his predecessor had recorded. Nor did Nalanda stand alone. It was the brightest star in a whole constellation of great monastic universities that flourished across northern and eastern India in these centuries. Sister institutions that shared teachers, students, and texts, forming a network of learning without equal in the medieval world. Above all, the knowledge nurtured at Nalanda flowed north across the Himalayas into Tibet, where it took deep root. So much of what would become the foundation of Tibetan Buddhism, its philosophy, its logic, its sacred texts, traced its lineage directly back to the masters of Nalanda. In a very real sense, the light of this one Indian university would go on to illuminate the spiritual life of an entire people for the next 1,000 years. For 700 years, this extraordinary place endured. Dynasties rose and fell in the world outside, but Nalanda continued, generation after generation, its lamps burning late into the night, its debates echoing late in its halls, its scribes copying manuscript after manuscript, its students arriving from distant lands and departing with knowledge that would enlighten their own countries. It was one of the longest-lived and most influential institutions of learning the world has ever known. And then, at the end of the 12th century, that long light was extinguished with terrible suddenness. By this time, a new wave of conquest was sweeping across northern India from the northwest, armies driven by conquest and by a militant faith that saw the great Buddhist and Hindu institutions of India as targets. Around the year 1193, a military commander leading these forces turned toward the rich and famous lands of Magadha, and there he came upon Nalanda. What happened next is remembered as one of the great tragedies in the history of human knowledge. The invaders stormed the university. According to the accounts that survive, the monks, the scholars, the teachers were slaughtered in great numbers. The buildings were plundered and put to the torch, and the great library, the ocean of jewels, the accumulated wisdom of 7 centuries, was set ablaze. So vast was that collection, so enormous the number of manuscripts, that it is said the library burned for months, its smoke hanging over the ruins, as 1,000 years of gathered knowledge turned to ash and drifted away on the wind. Try to comprehend what was lost in those flames. Not just buildings, which can be rebuilt, not just lives, tragic as they were, but knowledge itself, irreplaceable and unique. How many texts existed nowhere else on earth, their only copies stored in those towering halls? How many discoveries in medicine, in mathematics, in astronomy, in philosophy were reduced to ashes in those weeks, lost to humanity forever? We will never know, and that is precisely the horror of it. There is a specific kind of grief in the destruction of a great library, a grief that echoes across the ages, from the burning of Alexandria to the fires of Nalanda. It is the loss not of gold, which can be dug again from the earth, but of thought, of the hard-won insights of countless minds, gone in an instant and never to return. With the fall of Nalanda and of the other great centers of learning that shared its fate, the long and brilliant tradition of Buddhist scholarship in the land of its birth was broken, and Buddhism itself, which had flourished in India for over 1,000 years, went into a decline from which it would never recover in the land that gave it to the world. And so Nalanda passed into ruin, and then into oblivion. The jungle crept over its fallen brick. The great mounds that had once been its towers were forgotten, mistaken for ordinary hills. For centuries, the memory of the greatest university of the ancient world faded almost entirely from India's own consciousness. It was not until the 19th century that archaeologists, digging into these mysterious mounds, began to uncover the vast scale of what had once stood there, the acres of monasteries and temples and halls, and slowly realized that they had rediscovered the legendary Nalanda, a place they had known only from the writings of ancient Chinese travelers. Out of the earth rose the confirmation of the legend, the physical remains of a place so great it had once seemed almost mythical. So consider at the last what Nalanda truly represents. It stands as one of humanity's highest achievements and one of its deepest wounds. It is proof that more than 1,000 years ago, human beings built institutions of learning, of staggering ambition and sophistication, dedicated not to war or wealth, but to the pursuit of understanding for its own sake. And it is a reminder of how terribly fragile such things are, how the patient work of centuries can be undone in a few weeks of fire. The lamps of Nalanda burned for 700 years and lit minds across a continent. Their light was not fully extinguished, for the knowledge that its scholars carried to China and Tibet and beyond survived, and endures still. But we are left forever to wonder about all that did not escape the flames, about the ocean of jewels that was lost. Perhaps the truest way to honor Nalanda is simply to remember that it existed, to know that the love of learning burned that brightly, that long ago, in the heart of ancient India. If you would like to keep traveling with us through the forgotten corners of the human past, stay a while longer and let the next story begin.